Thank you very much once again for accepting our invitation. You are a physical anthropologist who has published around 70 scientific papers, 7 books, the latest one being On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. That was published last year, and you are Professor Emeritus at San Jose State University. That maybe our European listeners do not know, but correct me if I am wrong, is the oldest public university in the West Coast, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is the oldest public university in the West Coast. It's one of the what we call the California State Universities. So California has 2 public university systems. The University of California system, like that, like has like Berkeley, for example, and also then the CSU system, the California State University. And San Jose State University is the oldest of the public universities. And that's why we don't call it California State University San Jose, because its name predates the system even.
Oh, wow, that's impressive. So extremely old. And you are, it's okay if I say that you are a bone scholar?
Yes,
Because you are,
yes.
that's your field of expertise. And just to begin with, and maybe I think that the most important thing for people that are watching and listening to understand, because of course we're going to dive into what happened to you, the state of anthropology nowadays. But before anything, why are bones important? Why is it important to study bones?
So basically, um, skeletal remains, bones, can help us learn so much about the past. So we can help reconstruct what past people's lives were like before they had the ability to write history and tell us what their lives were like. So in a way, we're giving a voice to people who could not leave their voice or their written knowledge. And this helps us understand things like, what parts of prehistory is specific to a single culture versus what is universal and therefore really biological and evolutionary. The other thing that we do with skeletal remains is we use them to help understand forensics. So, for example, you would want to basically have someone who knows skeletal remains, usually taught with prehistoric skeletal remains or historic remains or even medical collections, to understand how to tell the difference between a male and a female, age differences, what a person died of, when a person was perhaps murdered and not found until they had only skeletal remains left over, right? So until their bodies became bones. And so one of the things is that physical anthropologists like me who study skeletal remains, we don't just look at remains of prehistoric peoples, we also look at remains of donated skeletons collections, and we also look at human evolution um, samples like Homo habilis, for example. And throughout my career, one of the things I've tried to do is I've tried to kind of think of my overall research as being split into several different main branches. One is to understand the past and the past people's lives. This sometimes included looking at unique individuals in a single collection from prehistoric California Amerindians. And some of the stuff, some of the material that I published actually ended up in medical journals because they're useful for medical doctors as well. Then I also have like a branch of research that looks at bone biology. So when things go wrong in bone, whether it is arthritis, joint disease, or infections, patterns of injuries, is that because of the cultural aspects or is it biology? Because if it's biology, then it should be applicable later in life, right? So later in time, so in our modern times, so that this means that we can use that same information not only for the understanding the past, but understanding the present as well. And so, like, for example, I did a study not too long ago on skeletal remains of Homo habilis, compared it to 3,000-year-old Native Americans, compared to forensic collections from South Africa. And what we looked at was patterns of bone fusion of the foot to try to understand whether fusion patterns of the foot with X-rays can tell us how old a person was. And we see that some of the indicators that were previously thought of as a person was young, like 20, actually are not good age indicators at all. And so this helps forensic anthropologists know what traits not to use to age a collection, but it also helps us understand human evolution. So I think that one of the misconceptions is that this knowledge is like very esoteric and can only be used in an abstract way. And anthropology is not that way at all. It's actually very applicable across a wide range of sources.
Everything that you just said highlights that studying human remains, skeletons, it's absolutely essential to enlighten our past, our present, and also to orientate us in the future. And in spite of that, currently anthropology doesn't seem very welcoming to the study of human remains and to the skeleton. And also I have detected, my work rather has detected several thought crimes in your statement, because you talk about evolution, you talk about universals, you talk about male and female, and all those things nowadays seems like, well, there is no place for that in academia, right?
Yes, and one of the funny things about my own case is, I've been talking about the importance of skeletal remains my whole career. And I've basically been talking about how we should not rebury remains. So in the US, there are laws that require giving bones back to modern tribes when there's really very little link between the skeletal remains and the modern tribes. For example, some of the Paleo Indians, the oldest of the human remains found in the US, are 7, 8, 9,000 years old, and they're being given to tribes that are maybe only 200 years old, right? So because new tribes come and so forth. So what we have, like in my own career, I have said, these laws ruin anthropology, and because we're getting rid of the data. And so basically, I've tried to say, what we really need to do is we need to put a focus on using the skeletal remains to reconstruct the past, to understand bone biology, help forensics, and so forth. And all of this was perfectly fine to say, even if people disagreed with me, until about 2020. I wrote a book co-authored with an attorney called Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which argued that we should not rebury bones. And I also pointed out in that book that the movement to rebury collections is part of a larger identity politics or woke movement where you split people into the oppressed and the oppressors, or the victims and the victimizers. And that basically in this movement, this woke movement, that those people who are defined as the victims are always right, regardless of what they say. So in the case of reburying bones, the victims are identified as those who are called Native Americans or Indians. And therefore, regardless of what they say, they're going to be right in this kind of woke ideology.
But
and
yeah.
if you look at the sex differences, it's again, the victims are defined as the non-binary or the trans. So what they say goes. And so after I got canceled for my Repatriation and Erasing the Past book, I also then got canceled for arguing that when you look at skeletal remains, there's male and female, and you cannot identify this kind of non-binary issue. And it's not, multiple genders, it's two sexes. And it's interesting that these two things seem so separate as two different issues, but they're really not. It's just one issue of this kind of woke identity politics. And of course, the issue I've written about, the cancellation of Darwin, in part because, that people say, oh, he was racist or sexist. But the other thing is that we have this kind of trying to cancel past scientists for their, basically for giving us a foundation for our science.
Absolutely. So this brings me, because what you're describing is, well, all these political movements, but what is the reception within anthropology of this? Because I have the impression, usually when you talk with people about the problems in academia being completely overthrown by wokeism, people usually think that, well, it's maybe only sociology or the critical studies, and they still assume that anthropology, and in particular physical anthropology, because of course in anthropology, we're going to talk later, there are lots of crazy things, but still you will say that physical anthropology is like, this wall of, like common sense and science. So I assuming that when this mob came after you, your university has supported you and all the scientific community has in anthropology has supported you, right?
Actually, it's kind of funny because I too thought that the cultural anthropologists, or what you might call the sociocultural anthropologists, would be the worst offenders of abandoning scientific facts. But I found out very quickly that archaeologists and physical anthropologists are just as bad. And what's interesting was when my cancellation occurred about in regards to the sex issue, it was the biological anthropologists or the physical anthropologists who really took aim at me for saying that sex is binary. And on the website of the American Association of Biological Anthropology, which used to be the American Association of Physical Anthropology, they basically put a statement that sex is not binary. And they have a statement on this right after I was canceled for saying this. So it was in reaction to it. And they end with some statement about supporting LGBTQ plus A, whatever, lives. And so they're turning the politics into science, as opposed to letting science be science and politics being politics. One of the reasons I think physical anthropologists have gone so woke is because they have guilt feelings about research from the past. But I would say that all fields have things that are things we would not be proud of now. But we can't judge the past people by today's standards. And then I would also say that a lot of times when research is blamed for bad politics or bad historical movements, it wasn't the research that was to blame. It was those people who enacted those political ideas. If you look at things, if you look throughout history, you can see that people who engaged in, let's say, attacking the Jewish people, the Holocaust, the Nazis, yes, they used some data from anthropology and eugenics, but they also had weird ideas about the cold earth creationism, and they were also really into vegetarianism and all sorts of things. So I don't think it's really fair to say, oh, well, had it not been for anthropologists doing this research, we wouldn't have had that atrocity. Of course we would have, because those people use whatever they can to fit it into their model rather than what a real scientist does, which is collect data to answer questions and then let the data lead them to the conclusions.
But still seems that anthropology, at least in the last decades, it has kind of started waging a war against what conclusions were bringing. And I am thinking in particular of the case of Napoleon Chagnon, very famous case that, I mean, of course, his conclusions were perfectly coherent with what evolutionary theory will posit, but at the same time, it was completely politically incorrect, to say the least. So they started acting against him. Somehow, of course, your own case makes me think of his case. But do you think that this is a trend that maybe nowadays it has become completely out of control?
Yeah, I think that this is a good example of how cultural anthropology and started with the issue, but that it's spread throughout all of anthropology. Napoleon Chagnon was actually a sociocultural anthropologist, right? So, but he took an evolutionary perspective or a sociobiological perspective. I had the great pleasure of meeting him at a Human
Oh, wow.
Evolution and Behavior Society conference many years ago. Um,
Wow.
and he his research on the Yanomami, the Fuse people, as he called them, was excellent for that time period. I mean, you can't get more exciting and more accurate ethnography of a people. I remember reading that, when I was in school. But they tagged him, they smeared him, they tried to act like he was engaged in giving them diseases to do medical experiments, or at least in cahoots with others. And it was the American Anthropological Association who really went after him. That is the same association that canceled my talk on the binary nature of sex. And um, you know, we would think maybe that would have that would have stopped and we would come to a census, but it hasn't. It's just spread like wildfire. And we see it now in all the fields of anthropology. I think part of this is related to, of course, the overemphasis on identity politics. But I also think that what's happened with anthropology is happening with a lot of fields. People are going into the field not because they love this field, but rather because they're interested in only themselves and their own tribe, so to speak, what I call the neo-tribes of anthropology. So for example, you go into anthropology. Anthropology is a study of people. And if you're a physical anthropologist, you say, well, I'm studying the human biology and bones of past peoples to understand them better. I'm not using it to try to understand my own life better. I'm trying to understand other people better. And that hopefully leads to better understanding of modern people too, and biology and so forth. But basically, the people going into anthropology nowadays are interested in placing their own identity onto the past. And so you get weird things like the queer archaeology interest group, where their whole purpose is to look at the past through a queer lens, or the Trans-Do task force, where these forensic anthropologists, their only interest is into pushing further the identifying trans people in forensic cases, or even like things that people may say, well, that's not too bad. Women's groups in anthropology. Why? I'm a woman. Why would I be interested in only studying women? Right? I want to know, about all people. But it's this kind of, putting their own image onto the past when it's in the physical anthropology study of the past, rather than really trying to understand the past.
Yes, this that you are describing, I believe that is called anthropology of the self, right?
Yes,
That
yes.
seems like an opposition, because if anthropology is the interest in people, by definition, other people, so it's like itself, it's not just a fancy name from narcissism.
Yes.
Um, okay, but the thing is, if I'm getting this correctly, so it's not possible to within some anthropological associations to try to make some scientific claims like the existence of male and female. The focus is rather put into things like myself and what do I feel and what do I think. But in a general term, for example, let's say that still, let's forget about the American Anthropological Association, but let's say that you want to publish a research paper, and a scientific paper using, for example, pictures of human remains. Can you do that?
Unfortunately, it's getting harder and harder to do that. One of the things is that there's kind of a movement to censor images. And this movement to censor images in anthropology, and physical anthropology and archaeology specifically, is about, again, identity politics, because the concept is that these images would upset Native American peoples, and therefore we should not use them. And so many journals now, for example, the Society for American Archaeology has a policy that all of their journals, and they have a lot of journals, you cannot use any photos of skeletal remains. Um, you may be able to use a line drawing, a picture that is drawn, but even that, if it's too realistic, don't be surprised if they say no, basically.
So, sorry, just I am interrupting. Let me get this straight. It's like we are getting back like 5 centuries ago, when you were not able to depict like human body anatomy. This is what
Right.
you're claiming. Okay.
This is what we're leading to. The California Society for Archaeology has a policy that any remains from a individual, so like historic figures, for example, cannot be shown. It doesn't matter if it's an X-ray, if it's a drawing, if it's a photograph. They will only accept drawings of generic bones,
So no
not
X-ray, not even an
no
X-ray,
X-ray, not even an X-ray.
because
Um,
there are like magical properties that pass from the
yeah.
body to the X-ray.
In my own time at San Jose State University, when they started coming after me for my for taking photographs of skeletal remains, um, and literally locking me out of the collections rooms that I curated the collections for 20 years or nearly 20 years. Um, they said that X-rays were sacred, and that the Native Americans would be burning these X-rays. Now,
Burning.
I, yes, so when the bones are given back, the X-rays will be given, and they will burn them. Now, this is a level of absurdity that I just cannot even wrap my mind around sometimes. But it goes further, because some people might still say, well, if it's connected to their culture, they may be, sensitive to it. I personally think that you shouldn't have anybody who can say, well, you know, I have to follow the rules of other people's religious beliefs, right? Because that's what they're saying. Sacred is about, their beliefs. Um, in the same way that I should be able to depict Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad,
Yes. Yeah.
without being killed or even being bothered, quite honestly. Um, and so, but it goes further than that, because one of the things that they did was, in my own university and other and anthropological associations, is they said, well, you can't show depictions of Native American remains, And then they expanded that. They said, well, you know what? Native Americans may feel upset if they see images of any skeletons. So even if that bone is from my own people, so to speak, I
So we should
wouldn't be
cancel
allowed to do it.
Halloween.
Yes, right. So I wouldn't be able to show it.
Wow.
Um, and then the other thing is in conference book rooms, they're now not allowing books with covers that show skeletal remains, whether those are photographs or realistic depictions. The Society for American Archaeology literally would not allow one of the covers of my books to be on display. The book was called Reading the Bones, Activity, Biology, and Culture, and it has a picture of me holding a bone in my hand and skulls in the background. It doesn't, you don't actually see me, you just see my hand holding a bone and then skulls in the background. And this is not allowed to be displayed. The Smithsonian, the National Museum of the US, the DC National Museum, Smithsonian's Natural History Museum, covered a Egyptian mummy that was on display because there were skulls from a forensic collection on the wall. So these are the absurdities that we're dealing with. And the Smithsonian also took down a website that they had a website about Jamestown, one of the colonies, one of the first colonies in the US, that and they had this great exhibit that was a temporary exhibit, but they created a permanent website about this exhibit that was like physical anthropology and forensics, where they looked at the disease patterns, whether cannibalism occurred in the colony because there was starvation, and tried to reconstruct these people's lives the most as accurately as possible. And so they had this website that showed these images that explained each skeleton. And then this website had activities that teachers could use for like the high school classes to get them interested. And they removed this website. And in place of this website, they now have a statement apologizing for the that they ever had the website initially. And they say, even though the descendants of the people, the Jamestown people, who were European Americans or Europeans, right? They were white people. Even the descendants gave permission for this, wanted it up, were for it. But the Smithsonian has decided in its wisdom to take it down to be more respectful. Respectful to who, I may ask? And so even though people say, well, you know, maybe this collection, my thing is, you know, maybe this collection is too sensitive to show. My perspective is that you, whenever you give an inch, they will take a foot, you know. And so we've seen this where it's first, you know, let's not show skeletons, then let's not show x-rays, then let's not show drawings. What is next? My prediction of what will be next is non-human remains, animal remains that Native Americans claim are sacred. That is my prediction of what is next.
But everything that you are describing, and now not to play devil's advocate, but to be very, very honest, everything that you are describing, it's the end of science. If I mean, this is, if I understand properly, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're describing is not just absurdities within research or absurdities within the museums, but if you cannot show this in textbooks, if you cannot show this in classrooms, and if you cannot see this in museums, so what we are stopping is literally the science of human beings, formerly known as anthropology.
Yes,
I am
I
exaggerating?
agree. I don't think you are exaggerating. I think that I think that there are still pockets in the world where anthropology is being done. And I hope that these areas stay strong and fight back the trend. But I do think that this will be the end of the science. And we've seen so many fields attacked. History, for example, literature, classical music, all sorts of fields of arts and sciences have been attacked by this kind of woke virus. But the difference is, in some fields, they will be able to recover. And anthropology, especially physical anthropology, once the data is gone, once the bones are reburied or the x-rays of those bones are burned, you cannot go back and recreate that field. There will be no data. Um, and that is a big problem. I think that we will see that the science aspect of anthropology is becoming smaller and smaller, and the identity politics is becoming bigger and bigger. And so then, the other thing is you will attract a different type of student. For example, when I started anthropology, I went into anthropology because I love anatomy. I think I love evolutionary concepts.
And I read in your book that you even started playing with body parts like plastic when you were a child.
Right, when I was a child. So it's been like a lifelong love of the beauty of anatomy, how the connections between us and other animals, like anatomical similarities, and and a real kind of desire to want to know what the past was like, kind of what these people's lives were like. And now people going into the field are not going in for those reasons. They're going in for different reasons, as we said, a study of self. But I also think it's people who are like looking sometimes for an easy field. And whoa, what is easier than bashing or scolding people from the past, right? Basically giving, saying how bad people 200 years ago, especially white European males, that's an easy field of study. And it's kind of interesting that, as we get better and better at reconstructing the past, because we, with better tools such as, improvements in the DNA research, a better understanding of bone biology, yet we're losing the data and we're not going to be able to progress. And I know like museums are not, they're not the same as universities, but museums are really where a lot of children get their first, spark of curiosity about these things. And so we're really affecting the next generation by removing everything.
And let's say that in order to maybe see a little bit the broader picture of anthropology, let's say that I want today to do ethnography, right? Can I just do as anthropologists were doing some time ago, like go in the middle, like live with the community?
Right.
That's okay?
I think that it's become harder and harder. Ethnography as well has become harder and harder. I think that there's more, a lot of cultural anthropologists kind of bemoan the fact that there's what they call helicopter science or helicopter social science, where a European goes into a indigenous population and studies them and then leaves, and so this is being kind of shunned or discouraged. The other thing is that some students are being encouraged only to study themselves. So like, we see that sometimes students, Hispanic students are told, well, why don't you study, Latinos in Los Angeles where you come from? And I was like, maybe they don't want to. Maybe they want to study the the people up on the Isle of Man above Ireland, and so there's this kind of, leading students to study themselves. And then the other thing is we have this kind of movement that, the urban anthropology, so people are studying, um, homeless people in your city or so. And I'm not saying that none of that is interesting, but it's not classical anthropology, and it's more sociology, or I wonder, like, if it's, in a sense, where are the new Napoleon Chagnons coming from? And I don't see them. And I loved, like all the ethnographies I read when I was starting my career, my academic career, in anthropology. Of course, Napoleon Chagnon, but also Turnbull's The Mountain People and the Forest People, and of course, then you have some of those fantastic um, uh, documentary films. And it's just we're not seeing that anymore, and that's a real loss.
What we seem to see a lot, though, in anthropology is what is called the ontological turn. All that has been posed by Philippe Descola in France and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro in Brazil, and people that are working into that. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but what is interesting is, because I wanted to ask you that, maybe even if you're not familiar with those particular authors in general, what is interesting is like the lack of epistemic rigor that is demanded to native or aboriginal communities in comparison to what we usually ask other people. For example, if you claim that there is male and female, we ask you for your sources. But if you claim any kind of thing that is completely nonsensical from a scientific point of view, if that's your culture, that's okay.
Yes, I think that is true. That we've abandoned rigor in that sense, and this is especially true if it is you're studying your own peoples, and it's also true even when people are studying others. I mean, in some ways, Margaret Mead began this problem by supposedly believing everything she was told. But we need to have anthropologists, whether they're cultural anthropologists or physical anthropologists, to show their data, explain their sources, rather than just say, believe them. And you'll hear when I go to meetings, I hear people, when their questions, I hear people say, well, why don't you believe them? And it's like, well, it's not necessarily that you're saying, you don't believe them, but you're saying, a, a scholarly move, work, whether it's ethnography or documentary or whatever, needs to have rigor and needs to have sources. And that's being definitely abandoned. And I think that cultural anthropology is probably the worst in that, but physical anthropology is not far behind.
Okay. And regarding rigor, there is another thing that I was fascinating reading the problems that you have encountered trying to study human remains, that sometimes some Aboriginal people, Native Americans or others, they claim some remains, even if there is literally 1,000 years that pass between the remains,
Right.
and there is a gap. And I don't know, it's like I'm from Spanish and Italian origin, and if I go 1,000 years, I'm pretty sure there is some castle in Europe that I can claim.
Yes. Yeah, that's in the US, in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand. Those are where the problems are the most pronounced. There are other places too, but those are where the problems are most pronounced. So in the US, we have this concept, we have what we call the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is federal, which is nationwide. But then we also have state laws. And the concept is that initially, when the federal law was passed in 1990, the concept was if there are clear links between a collection and a modern tribe, then the collection should be given to the modern tribe. And almost all of that was done immediately. So like historic collections where I still would say it shouldn't be given back because I think it's still loss of data, but that was the compromise. And anthropologists said, you know what, this is okay because we still have all these collections that are not really linked to any modern tribe. But then the compromise fell, and we basically get this kind of movement of saying, you know what, anything can be connected to any tribe as long as a tribe says so. And in the law now, especially in California, for example, but also in the federal law, if an elder says these remains, for example, some of the oldest remains are like there was a mummy found in Nevada, Spirit Cave mummy was like almost 10,000 years old and was repatriated to a tribe, a modern day tribe. There's no real evidence that they are linked. There's, you know, it was, there was, it just was, there was no evidence. But basically, what was done was the modern tribe said, we are linked to that individual, and therefore we should have that those remains. And what happened is over time, this was more and more accepted. And now some of the laws, like the California laws, even explicitly state if there's a disagreement between the science and the Native American narrative, then the Native American narrative has to be believed regardless of the science. So let's say you find remains that are 10,000 years old, and a tribe says, this is our wise one. We've been looking for him for millennial. We've always been here. This is the remains that belong to us. And then DNA studies are done, and it turns out there's no link. Then the collection still goes back to the tribe because there's two pieces of data, and if there's disagreement, then the tribe wins. And that's how it is now. Most people who look into this, who are interested into these topics, know about Kennewick Man. Kennewick Man was an 8,500-year-old, about, depending on what site you look at, you'll see a few different numbers, but 8,500 to 9,000-year-old skeleton discovered on the banks, river banks in Washington State, but eroding out. So, wasn't what happened was Jim Chatters did the first examination. He thought it did not look Native American. They actually thought it was a forensic case at first, so a recent murder. But then they saw this like little glint in the hip bone, and they saw he was shot with an arrowhead. And the last time someone was killed with an arrowhead is when,
Long time ago.
And so then they dated him, and they found out that he was ancient, And so the tribes in the region said, oh, that's our ancient one. We didn't come across any land bridge. We've always been here. This is ours. The US government then removed access from the skeletal remains, and a 2-decade-long lawsuit was underway about it. And in the meantime, one of the first things that the US Army Corps of Engineers did was they literally buried the site with about 600 tons of rock so that nothing more could be discovered.
Wow.
And so what ended up happening was they hired a team of government anthropologists to examine the skeleton. They conducted DNA. The first round of DNA was not useful. It didn't work out. The second round of DNA, a few years later, when techniques got better, they were able to get DNA out of Kennewick Man. And they compared it with a whole bunch of, different peoples and ancient remains, including the tribe that claimed that they were connected, the Colville. Now, one of the things is there's something like 570 federally recognized tribes in the US. So they didn't test every tribe. And the law says it should go to the tribe that it's most closely related to, not just a Native American. It's not, shouldn't be good enough just to be Native American. But there was a little bit of genetic link between the tribe and Kennewick man, as there is pretty much with everybody, right? We are all related. But the most closely related DNA was actually South American indigenous people. So it was not related in any meaningful sense to this Native American tribe. And yet, this was during the Obama era. Obama signed a congressional order to give Kennewick man to the tribe, and they buried him. So this is, in a way, even when the science shows that it's not linked, the scientists still lose. And I think what's interesting is then when you look at all the articles that the mass media produced about Kennewick man going back to a tribe, I wouldn't even say going back, going to a tribe, they say, oh, the DNA showed that they're linked, never mentioning that there was a much stronger link to South American indigenous people. Why would that be? It would be because he's not related in any meaningful sense to the North American tribe that was claiming him.
And this entire lack of rigor that you're mentioning, the assignation of to whom these remains go, also made me think in another problem that I believe you talk about, that is like, for example, let me give you a concrete example from the country where I was born, that is Argentina. And you had a problem in Patagonia with the Mapuche, that it's Aboriginal indigenous communities, but they claim to be indigenous. But the thing is, actually, they come from what is now Chile. So it's like they were never in Argentina, but still they have claims of land and of lots of other things in Argentina. So this is like, they are not real, they are impersonating. Yeah. So I believe that also that's a problem nowadays, right?
Yeah, and that's why that's the second group in my title, right? The pretendians. So these people who pretend to be Native American or indigenous, and sometimes people think they are and they're not. My sister was born in Oklahoma. My dad was retired Army. So when she was a child, my mother told her, oh yeah, you're born in Oklahoma, so you're an Indian. She's blonder, like super blonde. Of course she's not. But like when she was a child, she believed it. But some people grow up believing that. So, of course, there are those people who make that honest mistake. But there are people who know they're not Native American or indigenous and claim to be, and use it for their own purposes. So for example, if you're applying for a scholarship, there's scholarships for Native Americans. So things like that. So in my own case, the Native Americans who are in the San Francisco Bay Area, where my university was, San Jose State University, is southeast of San Francisco. The tribe that was very active against me and for the cancellation of me is known as the Muwekma Ohlone. DNA studies have shown that they have the same genetic makeup as Los Angelinos, people in LA, who are Mexican. So they're not native to the Bay Area. They may have some indigenous blood from Mexico, but they're basically Mexican Americans. And so we see this kind of, and ironically, some of the relatives of the previous tribal chief said, I don't know where she got this name, Muwekma Ohlone, from. I've never heard of it. And then other tribes say, oh, they're not real tribes. And they call out other people, so they're fighting against each other. Who's a real tribe, who's a real Indian as well. So there's a lot of infighting. But if you mention this, I've mentioned it quite a few times in meetings. And I say, well, what happens if you have a collection you want to study and it's supposed to be repatriated, and you have two tribes who both say that the collection belongs to them. And so many times when people bring up this, sometimes, hypothetically, but sometimes with real concrete examples, we're told that doesn't happen. Oh, that never happens. Of course it happens. It happens all the time. And so what happens is, what the end outcome of this is that collections are in limbo for years in curation facilities where people could study them, but because there's this fighting, they're not allowed to be studied. And so they're just staying in there without being studied. And this is another big problem.
And this brings me maybe to, I guess, the main question regarding your field. Everything that you are describing makes me think, I'm sure that you have seen this paper by Jerry Coyne and Luana Maruja on the ideological subversion of biology. And they make
Yes.
a very detailed outline of how biology, all the problems that biology has, how biology is changing in a way that seems to me pretty similar of what you're describing. And the conclusion that they reach is that in the immediate future, biology is going to be something entirely different of the science of biology that we know. It's going to be
Yeah.
something that it's a different thing. It's not science. And what you're describing seems to me this. So, I mean, first of all, I would like to know if this is your assessment also, and then
Yes.
how do you see the future of anthropology, not in 50 years, but just in 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think they're spot on. Jerry Coyne is someone I've spoken to a great deal, and Luana as well. A little less so. I know her a little, not as well as Jerry Coyne, but know both of them. And what they're talking about is spot on. I think that anthropology is further down the line, further down the line of destruction than biology. Um, I do. I don't know if we can turn it around. One of the interesting things is I think that some of these laws may be reversed, um, but the question is, even if these laws are reversed, have we filled the field with so many ideologues who are just interested in decolonization, identity politics, and so forth, that we cannot save the field? And I worry about that. Um, I not too long ago, like few weeks ago, I was reading this article by some people who work in Mexico, in central Mexico, and they said, you know, this the people here in central Mexico, they like showing displays of human remains in their museums. This is a way they show, that they um, show how much they respect their past culture. They think, they don't think it's disrespectful at all to put remains on display in museums and in books and, postcards, whatever. Um, and anthropologists are going in, Western anthropologists are going in and saying, no, you can't do this. And isn't it funny that these supposedly, woke anthropologists, these decolonizers, are trying to colonize this central Mexican area and saying, you can't do this. And I think that that's one of the problems too, is that, one of the things is I used to teach a class on mummies, and it went through, of course, Egyptian mummies, and went through all the different types of mummification. And then the last section of the class was on modern mummies, on people you know, some people who decide to be mummified. And students would sometimes say, oh, like, why would you want to do that? And I said, in a way, these were very politically correct students. I'd be like, why are we judging what is the proper way to treat remains, as opposed to saying skeletal remains, mummified remains are extremely interesting. Let's study them and let's try to move towards a culture that we don't think that, oh, well, doing this is weird, but but burial is normal. Because I actually think that even like in the whole Native American remains issue, many of those tribes didn't bury their remains, right? So a lot like the Paleo Indians, almost all of them were found eroding out of the earth, not in a cemetery or a grave, but But then you also get places like in the far north in Alaska where they didn't bury remains. They couldn't bury them, you know? Um, and so, you have the bog remains in Florida. And these are not all, it's kind of funny that the decolonization movement is actually trying to colonize the study of skeletal remains and mummies by saying everybody should be buried. And that's just not how life is and was. And I would say, if we should get to a point where we accept that there's a huge variety, but also a point where we say, you know what, we should, as anthropologists, we should divorce ourselves from the concept of sacred and belief and the afterlife only in the sense, we should only consider those senses in the sense of studying them, but we shouldn't personally believe them. And when people tell us, oh, well, you know what, I have to burn the x-rays because they're sacred, we shouldn't say, oh, yes, fine, that's good. We should say, actually, x-rays are not sacred. If you see this x-ray or if you see this bone, it will not harm you. And we should be teaching people that instead of, taking, appeasing their beliefs. And you would never get a evolutionary biologist, or maybe you would now, but you shouldn't get an evolutionary biologist who has people come into his class who are, creationists. And, well, you know what? Actually, if you think that those dinosaur bones were put onto by Earth for God to test you, I'm willing to accept that. I mean, that's basically the equivalent. And that's not my job. It never was my job. My job was to teach the past and biology and evolution as accurately as possible and to do the research as accurately as possible and to challenge people to reconsider the concept of spiritual or sacred.
And in your view, there are some particular actions that can be done in order to achieve that goal, or we have passed the point of no return and we should consider anthropology lost?
I don't want to say anthropology is lost, even though I think it might be. I think we need to basically push back and not, every time something like this comes, point out the absurdity, point out the similarities of other times scientists have pointed out the absurdities. That's why when I gave a talk at the Society for American Archaeology, which was canceled, the talk was pulled, it was recorded and it was pulled. I compared the belief of indigenous creationism with Christian creationism. I said, what is the difference? Why are we allowed to criticize one and not the other? And I think that we just have to continue chugging away and trying to get people to make this make sense. I mean, one of the interesting things is, we've made vast strides, for example, in organ donations. It's not 100%, but countries where organ donations were really paltry, were really scarce because of religious beliefs, excuse me. Basically, people have been convinced that donating organs is a good thing, and the numbers have shot up. That's not to say that these people abandoned their religious beliefs. They just moderated them to a position where they can still help others. And so we need to we need to push back and show that there are ways to save the skeletal remains, and to not accept the concept of, well, if you believe, you have to accept the religion.
And my last question for you is, if we don't fight back, if we don't save anthropology, or if we don't accept that anthropology is lost and we try to rebuild it somehow, what are we going to lose? Because just to give you two particular cases that came to my mind listening to you, the first one is, if we do not have all the things that you have mentioned, there is no scientific way to show us the universality of many things, that we are, as you mentioned, at the end of the day, one big family, because it's like humanity, you know? So that's the first thing. And the second one that came particularly to my mind when you were talking about mummies, it's, you know, once again, in Argentina, in particular in the north of Argentina, in the Andean part, you know this better than me, of course, but there is this museum that shows child mummies. And the thing is that the particularity with these child mummies is that with these children, they have been sacrificed for crops, on these kind of things. And of course, now there are some communities that claim that are related, that want to take that from exhibition. But the thing, and what I'm going to say is very politically incorrect, but I stand by that. If I do not know that in the past, children were sacrificed because we thought that was going to make crops, you know, be better, how can I appreciate the present and science and what I have?
Yeah, I think that is a very poignant point. So, you know, we started this conversation with saying anthropology is not just abstract. It's, you know, it really is applicable. And one of the applications is helping us understand the past, for us to be able to see the progress that we've made and to appreciate it, and to be able to see, you know, how to not villainize a single group. So, for example, children's sacrifices were common in many places. And so we shouldn't use these Andean sacrifices as an example of saying, oh, those evil Andean from 3,000 to 6,000 years ago or whenever it was. But rather to say, wow, these acts were actually quite common. And we've made so much progress to abandon that. And much of that progress was to abandon absurd beliefs and accept science and technology, right? So, but you know, another example of progress is slavery. Slavery was a worldwide issue. You know, we had slavery in North America and South America, and in ancient Egypt, in Islam, in Europe, and you know, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. And isn't it amazing human progress that we have not completely eliminated slavery, but almost completely eliminated slavery? I think that that's amazing. And once you start looking at the world like that, I think then you can say, you know what, we don't need to blame this one small group of people for these atrocities in the past, but understand, wow, we've made progress, and you know, we need to celebrate that. I think it's a unifying theme. We're going to lose the ability to identify victims of homicide, victims of mass killings. We're getting better and better at doing this, but you know, we're going to lose that ability if we don't have new forensic students studying the skills needed to. Most people don't realize that, like after 9/11, it was forensic anthropologists who went in and identified victims. So I think that
In
that's another
Argentina,
thing.
the victims of the dictatorship.
Right.
Yeah.
This is, you know, this is important work. It brings closure to families. And I think that we're going to lose that. Do we really want a forensic anthropologist who's never had their hands on bones? You know, I don't, you know. But the other thing is, you know, physical anthropologists have been key in teaching doctors, medical doctors, anatomy, because people who study medicine tend not to want to teach anatomy. So some of the most important classes in medical school are actually taught by physical anthropologists. We will lose that group too. So I think that it will have a huge effect on our ability to to teach doctors anatomy, to have good forensics, and to unify us by understanding the progress we made. You know, there's a university in Tennessee, for example, who just recently re I don't remember the exact details, but basically returned the teaching collection of skeletal remains that was used to teach human osteology, and um, then spent like $20,000 to buy casts, to buy models. Well, a model will never replace the real thing. And, in a sense, not only was this a waste of money, but it was a poor tool. And it's, when I was teaching human osteology, of course, students learned the bones in the of the human body, but they also learned how to identify a fragment. It's not just like, okay, it's not just okay. Well, anybody can do this. If you're looking at things like natural disasters, you have to know people who can identify whether that was human remains from a fragment, from maybe a 2 centimeter long fragment of bone. And this is what we're losing too. And so I think that it's important to realize that as exciting as some of the intellectual aspects are, and they are exciting, there's still questions to be answered about Neanderthals and about, our earliest in the species, Homo habilis, and so forth. And that all is very exciting. But there's also real world applicable issues that are at stake as well.
Professor Weiss, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for your powerful voice and for your courage in this fight. Where can people find your work?
I'm on Twitter now, known as X.
Okay.
And I do have a website which is listed on my Twitter account, but I'm terrible at remembering the website.
But your X handle would be your X.
And my X handle is at eWeiss Unburied. All
Okay.
one word.
We will write it on your description.
And if you need anything else from me, just let me know.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Much.
I will send you the reading so you can perhaps just have an idea of what we're writing and publishing.
Sounds good. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.